Hello, and
What?
welcome to Get Schooled.
Schooled.
This is Miss Prunier,
This is Mrs. Kingsbury.
and today we are going to be talking about. I'm not quite there yet, actually. Do you have it up in front of you, Miss Peter?
I do.
Okay.
We are going to be talking about Acts 1 and 2 of Romeo and Juliet.
Heck yes, we are. To get into our discussion today, we want to mention that there are many different movie adaptations of the film, which we did post on our Google Classroom pages, so you can check those out. We are not really going to go into a huge in-depth discussion about these movies because we are going to feature a special guest on one of our next podcasts. So stay tuned and wait for that because it's on its way. We also wanted to mention a few other movies that also kind of contain some of the themes we find in Romeo and Juliet. So I know when we were talking a few days ago, we started to kind of compile a list of all the more modern renditions of Romeo and Juliet, this kind of idea that there are two people from kind of different contrasting societal situations, if you will. So I was talking about Pretty in Pink, which is about like a rich preppy guy who meets a girl from the wrong side of the tracks. So that's kind of a similar depiction. Do you have one in mind, Miss P?
Yeah, I was actually trying to think about things that connected the stories in multiple ways. Like the parents don't approve of their relationship, or, something beyond the fact that they come from different sides. It's that beyond that their parents or their families or society doesn't approve of their relationship. So you got Twilight, right? I grew up with that. I read that in middle school, having the idea of different factors or groups of people and nobody really gets along and you don't really know why. It's just always been that way. Titanic, right? That's definitely a class system struggle, but it's the same idea of these two people met and it just hit it off and it clicked, and everybody around them didn't want that type of relationship for them. Really, all I wanted to mention was that this type of story, it's not really a trope. I don't know what to call it. I forgot the word. But this structure of story where two people fall in love, they come from different groups that don't agree, don't get along, especially if there's that family connection. That type of story has been around for hundreds of years, if not thousands. We have Pyramus and Thisbe in Greek mythology. You were talking about an old Arabic story that you read in college. There was an old poem right before Shakespeare that he definitely was inspired by, because it was called The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet. A little bit of plagiarism, but that's okay.
I heard that Romeo and Juliet was plagiarized, so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
You bring that up.
It was written in 1562, and it was just a poem, but it's literally the same story. So we can get into that when we talk about that film podcast. I just wanted to express that because a lot of people are like, oh, Shakespeare, he invented this story. No, he just took this framework, he took the structure, and he just went with it, and it works because there's something that we as humans find universal in this format. I think it's cool.
Yeah, super cool. Okay, so to get into it a little bit, we're going to start off with a prologue, then we're going to go into maybe some follow-up questions, talking about Act 1, brief summary, follow-up questions, same kind of structure for Act 2 as well. So, starting with the prologue.
Yeah. So not every story has a prologue, not every play has a prologue. Something that Shakespeare does really well, especially in Romeo and Juliet, is he includes these little blurbs. He writes them as sonnets usually, that introduce that act, that introduce the play and talk about what's going to happen. So when we have the prologue for the very first part of the story of the play, I use those interchangeably, he lets the audience know in 14 lines, exactly what's going to happen. It starts out with the chorus. So the chorus was either one person, sometimes in old Greek plays, it could have been a group of people. And they introduced the play by describing these two groups, these two families, saying that they have a feud that's been going on forever. And it also mentions that there's two star-crossed lovers, so introducing the theme of destiny. Star-crossed, it's beyond us. That they're going to meet a terrible fate and that they're not going to make it out of this alive. So you know right off the bat that it's set in Verona, Italy, that these two families are our main, interesting parties, and that from those two families, you get these lovers that aren't going to survive this. Beyond that, there's a lot of interesting components that are included in the prologue that I think we just wanted to touch on, because it's more than just a sonnet. It's more than just 14 lines. To include this at the start of the play was not uncommon at the time. The audience going into this, I'm sure they might have known about this type of story, but it wasn't uncommon that they would go into the play to watch it knowing exactly what was going to happen. It was still exciting and it was still, worth the money, but they knew exactly what was going to happen.
Didn't you mention in one of our conversations that the town crier used to memorize the prologue like this and then kind of go around and shout it from street to street? So it was almost like a movie trailer today, right?
Yeah.
That's how they had.
Yeah, so depending on the play, I'm not sure if they did this for Romeo and Juliet, but for a couple of different plays, there was some record that they would have the prologue either posted or performed out in the streets as kind of like a come all ye to our play. This is what it's about. Here's the Wikipedia blurb. Like, it's going to be interesting. There's a feud. There's a battle. It's got to be great. And it kind of drawed the audience in before they even bought the ticket. That is something that there's evidence to suggest, and I like to think that it was a town crier just shouting it out, these 14 lines of poetry. But the prologue was definitely used and passed around in public knowledge before the play even started.
So you mentioned this idea of fate or destiny. Could you go into some more detail on that and kind of explain, like maybe in your own words, what would you say is fate? What is destiny? Who controls that?
When we talk about Romeo and Juliet, there's definitely the religious aspect of, society has this plan for you, but also that God and your faith and everything around you is kind of predestined. Hi, that's my cat. Hi, baby. So when we have the prologue, one of the most important lines is saying star-crossed lovers. So that lets you know that their destiny, their fate, it was written in the stars. It's not really something that they had control over. So no matter what they did, no matter how they interacted, stop eating my food. Sorry. That these two young people were destined to be together. It was out of their control. And quite often critics will talk about that line and use the idea of destiny and fate to really think about, did they have any control over their situation? No matter what they did, were they going to die? So by including that in the prologue, I think it lets you know right off the bat that that's going to be something that Shakespeare incorporates throughout the play, that their fate is beyond them, no matter how they act or what they say.
So this is kind of a trick question. Well, what is what is the feud between the Montagues and Capulets?
No one knows. No one, they don't even know. It's the funny part. It's been going on for so long that even Montague and Capulet, which are the fancy names for the patriarchs of the family, right? So that's Romeo's dad and Juliet's dad. They just straight up go by their last names, which is pretty cool. They don't even know why they're fighting anymore. It's just been going on for so long. And it's nothing that they can really even talk out. I mean, that happens all the time. You don't even know the root of your problem. You just know that you're mad at this person. And, if people are loyal to you, they'll have your back and they'll support you in being mad at that person. There's no really just cause for this anger that we know of.
Um, so main themes to look out for in the play. Do you have any in mind that we should kind of keep in mind as we continue trekking through Acts 1 and 2?
I think the theme of fate, obviously, but also the idea of loyalty, especially in the first couple of acts when we start to get introduced to the different characters, we start to know what side they're on. It's very clear what allegiances there are, and that really pushes the plot along. And I think when you're looking at themes, you need to think about, how does this affect the plot? And if these characters weren't that loyal to each other, everything would fall apart. So loyalty is one of my favorite ones to talk about. By the end of it, we can talk about death, because there's more than just 2 deaths in this story. All right, it's a tragedy. A lot of people die, but I think sacrifice might be a better way to word it, because people are sacrificing more than just their lives. Before they get to that point, there's a lot of self-sacrifice and a lot of things that people are risking and putting in jeopardy.
Would you say that love is also a theme?
Yeah, of course. I mean, pin that with loyalty. There's romantic love, there's familial love. Juliet's nurse is like her mother. She's like a caretaker. So there's different types of love and connection. There's cousin love that goes beyond just family. Like Benvolio and Romeo are technically cousins, but the relationship that they have is so much more like brothers, Um, and
Do
then
you
obviously,
think that going off this idea of love, do you think that there's a way to define true love?
ooh, I think when we think about our characters, Romeo and Juliet, a lot of people look to this play as like a work of,
Like a love story.
yeah,
A
like a
love story.
pure, true love story.
Don't say what it really is yet, because I have a question at the end about it. So,
Okay.
oh my god, I
Um,
know. I know you're gonna go there because I know what you're gonna say. No, I don't. But do you think you can define true love?
I don't, this is going to sound super weird, but I don't know as if true love really exists, especially how it's reflected in literature. One of my favorite college professors, Dr. Trainer, shout out, he used to always say that art is imitating life, or that it reflects what we're doing. So it's putting order on the chaos that we experience. So if the chaos that we experience in real life is love and all of these emotions and all of our relationships, the literature that we read, the art that we see is supposed to kind of let us look at that from a different perspective. And I think Romeo and Juliet is definitely a lens into true love, but I don't think it's the entire picture.
Yeah, I wonder what. Well, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I wonder what Shakespeare's really trying to teach us here about love. Do you want to just say, or do you want to?
I think we can hold off until
Okay.
the end of Act 2.
Okay, I love it.
Hit
That's what I
upon
was
that
thinking too.
before.
That's what I was thinking too. Okay, perfect. So really quickly, I don't want to take too much time on this, but very quickly, I just wanted to zoom through the characters
Get it? Zoom.
in Zoom. So I wanted to really quickly go through all the characters that we've been talking about here. Can you see this, Miss T? I'm just making sure.
Yes.
Okay, groovy. So we've got the Montagues. We've got Montague, Lord Montague. He just goes by Montague.
Because they're so fancy.
Lady Montague. Romeo Montague to me sounds like a half rhyme. I don't think it is actually a half rhyme, but it half rhymes in my brain, so I'm like, that's how I'm gonna remember it. Benvolio, we've already noted, is Romeo's cousin, nephew to Lord and Lady Montague, and then they have various servants, Abram and Balthazar, who has the coolest name in the play. Right? I mean, come
Hands down.
on. Do you want to take over Capulet?
So the Capulets, the same family structure. Before we go into this too much, I think it is important to say that these are people of wealth. These are well-to-do families, to put it very lightly. In any movie rendition that you might see, they're living in castles. They have riches and robes and jewelry. So when we say lord and lady, that is a class stamp, right? This is letting you know that these are people of stature.
Actually, can I just segue really quickly? So I know this is a segue, but so Shakespeare is somehow related to my husband's family. And so my husband comes from lords and ladies. There's a town called Kingsbury outside of London, and it's called, I don't really know that much about it because I married into this family. So Shakespeare's not really related to me, but I just think it's kind of interesting that somehow very distantly, like through marriage or something, like Shakespeare's related to the Kingsbury family. And also,
cool.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. But
that's cool enough.
I think it's very cool, but I hope I get to go there someday. That's all.
Yeah, let's go. Class trip. So the Capulets, we have Lord Capulet, goes straight up by Capulet. Lady Capulet, his wife, their daughter Juliet. With Juliet Capulet, the idea that we have rhyming or even half rhyming names is part of, putting that order on the chaos. There's a lot of characters. So when we have rhyming names, at least in my mind, when I hear something that is easier to remember, like a rhyme, it's meant to, solidify the idea that this is someone of importance. So Juliet Capulet, at least the ending of that, it's a little bit more snappy. Tybalt, who he is Juliet's cousin. He is also quite a tough guy. When we get into him, I have some strong feelings about this kid.
Oh, God, I do too.
And he has some strong feelings about Romeo. So we will talk about that. And then Juliet has a nurse. So technically this is the woman that took care of her. She's kind of like a lady's maid, but she's more than that. She is essentially a mother figure. And then Peter, who is one of their servants. There's a lot of different servants and like smaller characters that might have a name, but they're not really important. Do you want to talk about the prince?
Sure. Prince Ascalus. I don't really know that much about the prince, but I do know that he's related to Count Paris and Mercutio, one of our favorite characters in Shakespeare. Mercutio is probably one of the most complicated characters in this play. And pretty much anytime he's talking, you can expect some naughty, naughty words to come out of his mouth. He's a pretty, he just speaks. It's interesting to me that he has royal blood in his veins because he speaks so informally to people sometimes. And then we have finally Friar Lawrence, who is similar to the nurse in that he's more of a mentor to Romeo, more maternal towards Romeo. He is a kind-hearted cleric, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a short while. Yeah. So that was our little breeze through, zoom through the characters. Yes. Onward to Act 1, right?
So when we read the prologue, we get that little brief introduction. The story starts out letting you know that it's broken up into a couple different scenes. So when we change scenes, we're not going to be talking specifically about the change of scenes. We're going to be talking about this as each act. But when we have a change in scene, when you guys are reading this, or if you're watching this and you notice that literally the scenery is changing, or they're moving somewhere else, or it's shifting to a different group of characters, that is a change of scene, technically, in the play. And that was used to, make it easier to progress and kind of keep the audience interested. So we're going to bust through each of the different acts in their own time. Little brief prologue. When we get into Act 1, it starts off with a fight. This was a couple of servants, Montagues and Capulets. They kind of meet up. They're teasing each other in the street. It ends up in a brawl that takes over the entire courtyard, right? Whatever the setting is, whatever the interpretation is, it's the Capulets and the Montagues having this physical brawl. It started out with just teasing, and then one of the guys was like, yeah, you want to go? Want to fight? Let's go. All right. Bet you won't.
Do you bite your thumb at me, sir?
Which is essentially flipping the bird, right? They're insulting each other. They're saying, like, you won't do it, you know? And then
yes,
it gets
I
to be,
will.
yeah, like they're just teasing each other, but they're such loyal people to their households that they have to, you know, follow through with this fight. It gets to the point where Capulet himself and Montague himself join the brawl. It doesn't end until, you know, Benvolio's trying to say, like, dudes, guys, you know not what you do. Like, there's no reason for this. Calm down. He's trying to break it up. By the time the prince enters onto the scene, he is angry. He's saying that this has happened way too many times. The next time there's a fight in my streets, your lives are going to pay the forfeit of the price, or whatever that line is. I just messed it up. Essentially saying that Capulet and Montague are going to have to pay for this with their lives if there's another big battle. Moving on from the fight, Benvolio goes to find Romeo because he wasn't there, and that's a little weird. Romeo is usually hanging out at the same place. So Benvolio goes away. Capulet, after he talks to the prince, after they have that discussion, meets up with Count Paris. Now, Count Paris, we kind of just talked about. He's a kinsman, so a relative of the prince. He is of high class, and he is interested in marrying Juliet. Capulet, Juliet's dad, is talking to him about this, and he's saying, you're a little too eager. She's 13 years old. Let's give her some time. Try and woo her. Try and win her over. And then Capulet's like, you know what? I have a feast. I have a ball a little bit later. Why don't you go and we can figure this out? You know, that's a good opportunity for you to try and win over my daughter. What she has to say is just as important as what I have to say, which, if we can take a moment, that's pretty progressive for Capulet, right?
Yeah, that is for sure. Actually, yes, I was thinking the same thing when I was rereading it.
It's not common. It's much more common for parents, especially of high class, just be like, I like you, you're going to marry my daughter. You're going to set her off and have a nice, happy life. Capulet's like, I care about what my 13-year-old daughter has to say. So that's pretty cool. Romeo and Benvolio hear about this party. They think it's a good idea. Benvolio is trying to get Romeo out of a little bit of a funk, right? There's a girl named Rosaline that he was interested in that doesn't love him back. So Romeo's moping around. And Benvolio hears about this party, and they try and get them to, you know, let's use that as an opportunity to get back on our feet. Once we hear about this party, we hear about the nurse and Lady Capulet and their impression of Paris in a discussion with Juliet, kind of urging her to take this seriously, right? They talk about, have you ever considered marriage? She's like, I mean, it's an honor, but I am a little young. I'm not really thinking about it, Ma. And they're kind of just gassing up Paris and talking about him as if he's the hottest piece on the entire market. And the nurse gets a little bit of a dirty birdie, a couple of lines there. So we are introduced to her as, yes, a maternal character, but her language also lets us know that she is of a lower class, and that Juliet cares about her a little bit more than her mother. We can see that in their interactions and some of the words that they exchange. But Juliet is still very respectful. She's listening to what they have to say. She's like, I'll consider it. I'll go to the party. I mean, of course, but no promises, Mom. I could spend an entire hour talking about scene 4 and 5, but the main things that we have to take away from the next couple of parts of Act 1 is that Romeo needs a little bit of convincing to go to the party. He has a little bit of a premonition that this might not turn out well. You know, something that happens tonight is going to lead to a darker destiny, and he has that feeling in his bones. But Mercutio, who's also a kinsman relative to the prince, is kind of urging him to go. He's like, just embrace life, right? What is the point if we can't, experience this a little bit? So they go to the party, and this is Romeo, Benvolio, Mercutio. I know their names all kind of sound the same, but all of Romeo's buds and a couple of their other friends, they're heading into this Capulet party, which, as we noted before, not necessarily a good idea. Why is it not a good idea that these Montagues are going to a Capulet party?
Stabby stabs.
Stabby
Stabby
stabs.
stabs.
It's not a good idea. If they get caught, it could literally risk everything. But at this party, Romeo sees Juliet from across the way. Tybalt, Juliet's cousin, also sees Romeo. So it's kind of like this little triangle thing that they're looking at each other. And Tybalt wants to hurt Romeo immediately just because he's a Montague and he is in their realm. He's in their world. This is a Capulet party. How dare he? He's an enemy. And again, progressive Capulet, he's saying, nah, dude, let him be. He's not hurting anyone. There will not be a fight, not at my party. And that makes Tybalt even angrier. So when we end Act 1, Romeo just saw Juliet. He's feeling some type of way about her. Tybalt saw Romeo at their party. He is angry. And Capulet proves again that he's the coolest dad in the story. And then when you end scene 5, it lets you know that Romeo and Juliet are going to be interested in each other. There's a little bit of flirty smooshing going on. But it's unclear how much that's going to progress because Tybalt is a definite threat.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you some questions, some follow-up cues about Act 1, starting with, and you mentioned this a little bit, but how embedded is this feud between the Montagues and the Capulets?
It is so much a part of their lives that it changes, where they can go in Verona and who they can talk to and probably who they can buy stuff from.
Well, it was interesting because you said that even the servants have clearly formed opinions about this. Even servants are willing to fight to the death for these families. They don't even know what the problem is, too. So that's kind of interesting, too, that it's from ancient grudge. Like, I don't want to go there because that's probably the last sonnet in the play, but new mutiny, Yeah. So I don't know. It's really interesting.
Yeah. The loyalty of everybody around them, it's you were on one side or you were on the other. I think the only parallel that we can really feel nowadays is when we have a political party and it's during debate season. We have that allegiance, if you feel that way, towards either a political party or a person representing that party. People will fight about what they believe in and what they truly feel. And that's definitely the same way that the Capulets and the Montagues kind of controlled the people of Verona. The prince was obviously in power, but this loyalty runs so deep that I found it kind of shocking that Capulet was okay with Romeo being at his party. I don't necessarily know if Capulet has much of a character development as Juliet's dad, because he's kind of showing us from the very beginning that the feud is important, but he's willing to, break some of his strict rules as far as, letting Romeo into his party. It doesn't really seem like a big deal. But then by the end, he kind of changes. So that's a little bit opposite from what you might expect.
So next up,
Yes.
what is your first impression of Romeo in the play?
When we meet Romeo, we just had that big battle at the very beginning. Romeo's been moping around. He's really heartbroken about this girl named Rosaline that, we don't even know if he talked to her. We just know that he's upset because she doesn't love him. Um, and the first time I read it when I was about 15, I definitely took pity on him, because he's definitely a well-to-do, rich, attractive young man, who's upset, and he's emotional. He's wearing his emotions out on his sleeve. He's expressing his sadness in the world, and he sees the fight that just happened, and he's like, oh, woe is me. But at the same time, everybody else around him is so strong-willed and is either willing to stand for what they believe in and fight, or is willing to stand in the fight and try and break it up. That's Benvolio. So Romeo's kind of a foil to all of the people around him, or backwards. They're all foils to different aspects of Romeo. But by the fifth time I've read this, I was just done. I'm like, Romeo, just stand up and own it. It's okay. You'll find love eventually. But he's definitely the emotion embodiment of the play. He's head over heels about anything and everything.
He's emo.
He's very emo.
He's super emo. That's what I was thinking when I was rereading this part. I was like, oh my god, what an emo. I was emo, so I feel like I can say that now. So who is Rosaline?
Rosaline, funny enough, is another Capulet. Just probably a cousin or relative to Juliet, probably around the same age. We don't know if Romeo even met her, if they ever talked.
We don't know.
He's just like, that girl, she's real pretty, and he just melts. Either way, he's a mess. Something happened where he's like, what's the point of living if I can't be with her? I'm a mess. I'm head over heels, and he's just broken up. But Benvolio is there to try and cheer him up and get him back on his feet. So he's a good guy.
I wish okay. I don't know if that's where he says it. I'm trying to find it, but you know how we find out that she's going to remain chaste and so therefore remain a virgin. Is it true that now I'm kind of forgetting, I'm a little bit fuzzy on this. Does she decide to become a nun?
Rosaline?
Yes.
I think so.
I feel like she wants to become a nun, which I've never read it this way before, but I was looking at so clearly if Romeo did have a relationship with her, if they had a relationship and he finds out that she's not into him because she wants to live this kind of chaste lifestyle as a nun, then I'm almost wondering if he tried to get maybe physical with her in some way, shape, or form. Maybe he tried to kiss her or something. I'm just saying, I'm not saying he tried to assault her. I'm just saying that he might have tried to flirt with her and she turned him down because she doesn't want that life.
Yeah. But it could have even been something that he heard, at the watering hole, or eavesdropping into some conversation, that this,
that's true.
this hot girl that he was interested in from a distance is going to become a nun, and he's talking about how much of a waste it is because she's so beautiful, and she could have been his partner and they could have been together. And you can definitely take that sexually. You can take that to mean that relationship.
Well, it just bothers me that he's this upset, I think. As maybe somebody who's seen it, the movie so many times, and read the play several times, I just feel like how can you justify that kind of extreme emotion That's just something I'm wondering about. That's more of a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
So contrasting Romeo's introduction, how is Juliet introduced in the play?
When she is introduced, we have around her her mother and her nurse. So there's kind of this split scene where Juliet's mom is talking to her about Paris, and the nurse is talking to her about, you know, how she's always been there and she knows everything about Juliet, and she knows that Paris is, oh, he's a flower of a man. Like, he's just the best possible option. But the nurse is also being very explicit. She's quite the dirty birdie, and I love her for that because she's a contrast to Juliet's actual mother. But at the same time, Juliet is surrounded by these maternal figures. So I think it lends itself to the idea that Juliet is supported and well cared for, but that she's also her own person. She has the freedom to have her opinion about marriage. She has a freedom in this conversation to say, I will think about Paris, but, you, mom, wanting me to like him won't make me like him. So she's a little bit less invested in love and romance than we have that intro from Romeo. We still get the idea that relationships and love, at least in the sense of marriage, is a big role in their society for both of these characters.
I just want to say one thing because I found this part in my this is from college, so
Yeah.
I have like all my annotations from the college classes I've taken on Shakespeare, and so the nurse is kind of revealing to us also that she is Juliet's wet nurse, and what a wet nurse was at the time, if you don't know, was somebody who would essentially breastfeed your child for you. Usually somebody that had either had kids of their own at home and they had enough, milk to like help out a higher class family like the nurse has. In the nurse's case, she lost her daughter Susan, and so she, was ready to essentially provide for a child in that way, but did not have a child to provide for. And so she's hired by the Capulet family to take care of Juliet. And one day, when Juliet's a toddler, she falls down, and her husband says, the nurse's husband says, Yea, quoth he, dost thou fall upon thy face? Thou wilt fall backward when thou hast more wit. So basically, when you're older, you're going to fall on your back. And then later on, the nurse continues on, even though Capulet's wife is telling her to shut up because you're talking too vulgar. Your conversation is not appropriate for Juliet. She goes on to say, yet I cannot choose but laugh to think it should leave crying and say, aye, and yet I warrant it had upon it brow a bump as big as a young cockerel stone. So she's talking about how Juliet gets this bump on her head that's as big as is this a chicken's testicle? So she gets pretty colorful with her language. And then she continues to go on to say, thou will fall backward when thou comes to age. So they're referring to sex. They're saying that she's going to fall back on her back, lay backwards for her husband, and become submissive to her husband at that point. What did we? Oh.
So something that's a little important that I don't think we've been very clear about is that Juliet is 13 years old when this whole thing is going down.
So do you think she's too young to get married?
It's hard to answer that. I think when we talk about age and our reactions to it, at least in our culture, we have this kind of guttural reaction to saying like 13, like, geez, no, maybe her first boyfriend, maybe her first kiss, but like 13 is too young to be getting married. When we look at it through the lens of the late 1500s, the 1600s, it wasn't uncommon. Juliet's mom even says, Lady Capulet says at one point, that she was younger than Juliet when she was married. So Juliet's mom is probably in her early 20s at the
Yeah,
time.
I have it. She says, by my count, I was your mother much upon these years that you are now a maid. So she's kind of, she could be exaggerating a little bit because she's kind of claiming that she's under 30 years old at this point. Um, so there are some directors that choose to exaggerate that line. I would say Baz Luhrmann does that. I don't think that Zeffirelli does, but that's a different podcast topic.
Yeah.
Movies.
The movies. But it's still very clear that for a 13-year-old, she is an independent person. She lives at home, so she's not on her own yet. But she has the freedom of thought and decisions in her own life, which is definitely a much more adult characteristic. When we talk about Paris marrying her and being interested in her, he is older. It's unclear how old he is. I would say that he is at least 25. He's probably her mom's age, if not older.
Yeah, he's in his, I would say he's in his late 20s, early 30s or something.
Yeah.
Something like
So you get like this initial reaction saying like he's twice her age. That has to make you feel something in like the no realm. But at the time it was pretty normal.
I think it's really interesting to think about how Capulet kind of goes from telling Paris, no, she's too young to get married, to being convinced that, okay, well, I guess if you need her and she likes you, you can woo her.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's a pretty reasonable train of thought for somebody that's giving their daughter's hand in marriage to somebody of such a high social status at the time. That's a logical decision to make. At the same time, she's 13. And for all that it was not uncommon for girls that young to get married, it wasn't necessarily looked at as a good thing for young girls to get married, because he does say at one point that young wives can sometimes, if you're too young when you get married, you sometimes ruin your life. He makes a comment like that. I'm trying to find it, but
yeah,
I feel like whenever I'm looking for a specific quote, I flip 4 ages. So
yeah, I think that's in scene 2. And when they're talking, when Juliet's dad is talking to Paris, there's that bit of an illusion that he's also talking about Juliet's mom, saying like maybe she was too young when we got married, and letting them know that maybe Juliet has to wait a little while. Maybe it's not the right thing at this time.
yeah. So okay. So then let's see. When we finally see Mercutio, he's also with Benvolio and Romeo, with all his buddies. Saturdays for the boys.
Yeah.
Why do they go to the Capulet party?
Well, Mercutio is down to clown any day of the week. So Mercutio is kind of like that one friend that you call to go out to ice cream with, and he's just, maybe he has a convertible and he's just zipping around blasting music, and he's the one who will jump up at the karaoke bar kind of guy. He is the life of the party, and I think that's a little ironic because he doesn't take life too seriously.
He's so funny.
He's very much the comedic center, and when he gets serious, it gets kind of scary. We can talk about that in its own podcast if you want. I think Mercutio is enough of an interesting character that you could write pages and pages of analysis on him. But they really go to the party to kind of get Romeo out of his funk. There's other girls to look at than Rosaline. Let's go to this party. There's going to be a lot of eligible babes there. It's going to be great. Just forget about her and we'll have a good time. Saturdays for the boys. Let's party. Let's relax. Something that we haven't really mentioned yet is that they do have to wear a mask. This is a masquerade. This is a ball, but everyone's kind of hidden. So when we talk about, they have to be kind of sneaky, they get in walk right past Capulet, who's even like, hey, I remember when I was your age. Yeah, party, have fun. And all of the guys, all of Romeo's friends, they kind of just walk right into the party because they're wearing these masks and they can, you know, hide behind this kind of shield who they really are. But ironically, that lets them be more true to themselves. And it lets Romeo feel comfortable enough to look at and pursue Juliet by the end of the party.
I think it's really important to mention that Shakespeare absolutely loves to do this to you. He loves to put his characters in a costume of some kind, disguise them in some way, shape, or form, so that it can like spur the plot forward, but it also adds that additional question of, is this person being true to their character? So that's very important to consider. So also I wanted to add that when Peter the servant is going out to invite people to Capulet's party, we find out that Peter can't read the list of people who have been invited to the party. And actually, I have these notes in my book, so I kind of want to read it. It's kind of some more body language for you. So he's asking people that are educated in the street, and he happens to come upon Benvolio and Romeo. He asks them for help reading. And he says, "It is written that the shoemaker should meddle with his yard, and the tailor with his last, the fisher with his pencil, and the painter with his nets. But I am sent to find those persons whose names are here writ, and can never find what names the writing person hath here writ. I must to the learned in good time." So he's looking for somebody who's more educated. It is important, I think, to note as well that the lower classes were not educated. They were mostly working people, working class people, people that worked usually agricultural jobs outside as servants, in domestic help. All of those things he's referring to, though, the meddling with your yard and the tailor with his, it's all talking about fondling yourself inappropriately, basically. And so it's interesting because my professor must have pointed all these things out to us. So I really wish I remembered more of these lectures, but it was about 10 years ago, to be fair. And then also, when they're looking at the list to help Peter out, so Benvolio and Romeo are helping out Peter, they see that Rosaline's name is on the list of people who are going to be at the party. So that kind of really interests Romeo. Romeo's really interested in going all of a sudden, but Benvolio wants to go so that they can look at all the other girls. And then he actually says, "I will make thee think thy swan a crow." So they're trying to find a girl that's prettier than Rosaline, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's essentially like, okay, if you think she's so hot, let's put her side by side with all of these other women and see if she's really as hot as you remember. Maybe there's going to be some, challenge to that idea. But I do want to underline again, just like what you said, if anybody is of lower class in these stories, they're not talking in poetic language, first of all. And also, there's usually some type of innuendo or double meaning that is very sexual. You have that from the nurse. You have that from Peter. In the very, very beginning, the first section of text from the servants before they even start the fight, they're talking about, taking a woman's virginity. There's all of these conversations throughout the play that are meant to get the people in the audience laughing and kind of more invested in the story. It makes them more real and more relatable for the audience. If you're of higher class, higher stature, like Lady Capulet, they have these reactions to those conversations in a more disgusted way. But part of what I think you had mentioned a couple days ago was that Mercutio kind of balances that line. He's very dirty and flirty, but he's also supposed to be related to the prince. He's supposed to be higher up on that totem pole, right?
I wish I really knew the family tree there, because how is the prince related to, that's maybe just a question for us, maybe homework for us to do, to investigate, because I'm just curious, how is the prince related? There might not be an answer either. It's just, oh, I'm Shakespeare, they're related. That was my decision.
I think the only definition that we have is that they're kinsmen. So that means that they could be cousins. It could be.
It could be anything, but it's just I just want to know how. And I also, knowing that, I just want to know, is Mercutio so distantly related to the prince that he might be of the lower class? That's something I wonder. I mean, he doesn't seem to, I mean, I don't know. Maybe he just happens to be, I don't know. It's just something I'm curious about.
Yeah.
Um, so at the end of Act One, when Romeo and Juliet meet, do you think they have fallen in love at first sight?
If we look at the language, I think it's clear that Romeo is immediately heavily invested in pursuing her. He goes around the party trying to find her, trying to maintain eye contact. He's having these little asides to himself where he's just talking about like, oh my God, she is gorgeous. Over and over again, he's just repeating like, who is that? Like, what? And once they actually meet, you do get this brief idea that Juliet's attracted to him, that she's maybe interested, but she's much more hesitant to actually go there with him, and not go there like sex yet, but go there like engage with this relationship and this flirtationship that they have. There's a lot of puns that they make back and forth, about being holy, and maybe the opposite of that with having taken part in sin sometimes.
Oh, it's today it's overwritten. You know, your hand is the unworthy. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine. I mean, it's like, I don't know. Romeo kind of rubs me the wrong way. This time, that's just my opinion reading it this time. I know I'm being biased, but it weirds me out that he's trying to kind of grab at her a little bit too. I don't know. He gets grabby with her. Maybe that's just my interpretation, and I don't mean to. It just kind of irks me that he doesn't say hi to her. He doesn't have a conversation with her. He goes right to grabbing her hand and kissing her hand, and I
Yeah.
don't know. Maybe I'm just
So
too moody about it. But
I am looking at Act 1, Scene 5. This is around. Okay, so it starts at line 90. This is immediately the first thing that Romeo says to Juliet. The funny thing is that this starts a sonnet that they write together through their dialogue, and it doesn't end until Romeo kisses her.
right.
So the first interaction that they have is a love poem that is kind of them back and forth saying these puns, that are flirty and talking about religion and faith and
Pilgrims, people who
pilgrims. And
shrines.
we can talk about the puns in a whole different episode, but the fact that it ends with their kiss is so monumental that everything else around them kind of just fades away. When I read it, it doesn't really make sense unless you take the time to break down those puns and like the double entendres that they have. But when Romeo says, oh goodness, this is ridiculous. He says, oh then, dear saint, right? He's calling her a saint. That's not lightly used. Let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. And Juliet says, saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake, to which Romeo cleverly responds, then move not while my prayer's effect I take, insinuating that he's been praying for the moment that he would meet his true love or meet Juliet, saying that he's been wanting this for a while, all the while comparing her to a very religious, wonderful type of person in a faith that they both, practice.
If you just go through and you kind of look through all of the holy Palmer's kiss and two blushing pilgrims, and it's all kind of the same stuff, but it's It is in the form of a sonnet. It's just so idealized. It's just so it's too perfect.
Yeah. So when Shakespeare writes, as we mentioned before, if he's writing in poetic language, there's a reason, right? He's taking time to write this out in a way that either makes it flow or, if you finish someone's sentence, especially in iambic pentameter, there's like that "you complete me" vibe that's unspoken. So for them to complete this sonnet in their first interaction, it is so much like two puzzle pieces just fitting together, and it's a little too perfect. Um, Shakespeare had to practice the fact that this is a sonnet, this is an iambic pentameter, so it's measured out every beat, every second and word
Every I am.
syllable, uh, and the rest of it is written in poetic language. But once they kiss, then they're just two people having a conversation in poetic language.
So, last question, and then question for you actually before the last question, real quick. This is unscripted. Do you think we should cut it off after Act One today? Because we might need to do a separate episode for Act Two.
Yeah, we can take a break
Okay.
and do Act 2 a little
Okay.
bit later.
I think that sounds good because this has taken longer than I thought, but it's so thorough and awesome. So, last question, and I think this is actually, it flows nicely with where we were at before. What do we think at this point Shakespeare is trying to teach us with his most famous work, and why is his message so frequently misinterpreted?
I think it's important to underline that he didn't expect this to be his most famous work. He was, as many people are, much more popular in death than he was in life. When we talk about Romeo and Juliet and people, romanticize it and they think that this relationship is perfect in every way, shape, and form, and they're like looking at Romeo and Juliet as this pinnacle of romance, I think it's dangerous to our idea of true love and our idea of romance. But at the same time, when we look at what it's done for other pieces of literature and other interpretations and other movies, I think how people interpret that relationship and their story together lends itself to how diverse of a perspective humans have on what love really means. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's really interesting to me because I had a student write an article about how this is totally off topic, but I had a kid write about this idea of online dating and how it has ruined dating for kids. Like they don't go out and they don't go to physical locations anymore. There's no courting process or wooing process. There's no, I just remember it was so different even for me than it is for people today. It's so weird. It wasn't that long ago, and it's not like the differences between my generation and my parents' generation either. I mean, my parents used the phone, and I use the phone. Now my younger siblings are using. It's just so weird. Cell phones and different apps to reach out to people. It's
Yeah.
just super weird. And this idea of love and actually the idea of cheating on people, it's so much easier today. And so this idea of what does it take to gain somebody's trust becomes a question. If you earn somebody's trust, then you know that they're loyal to you, right? So I guess that's one of the bigger questions I have. Can we trust Romeo?
Yeah, he's kind of expressing um, interest in Juliet in a way that a lot of people who are used to online dating or used to Snapchatting people, if that's how you woo each other, it might come off as creepy and it might come off as, hi, kitty. It might come off as not the right way to interact with someone. But what he's doing is really just how they would go about these relationships. You got it. I think it's interesting that loyalty is such an important part in the lives for all of these people. But once they start interacting across those family lines, the idea of loyalty and trust for each other is something that they're both a little.
They're working on that definition,
Yeah.
how to define that and how to exist in that defiance of their own family name. That's fascinating.
Like,
So,
can they be loyal to each other while still being loyal to their family and what their family stands for in this feud? Who are they if they're not feuding?
I just thought that Act Two was Act One for a second, and so I'm mixing up all my scenes in my head, and I just thought, oh no, I never asked you that question, but I did. Never mind.
We'll do that next
So,
time.
yes, we will. So, stay tuned. Next time, got schooled.